In 1994, my parents left me at a baggage claim and told me to count to 500. While I was crying in a deserted terminal, they were cashing a $500,000 check, having officially declared me dead for the insurance money. 30 years later, these parasites are back, demanding my love and my inheritance. They thought the dead couldn't seek revenge, but I found the casino receipts dated the very night I disappeared. Would you give them a second chance, or would you grind them into dust? I am Eleanor Sterling, 34 years old, sitting at the defense table in my own courtroom. My thumb traces the fringe of the emerald wool scarf draped across my lap. Across the aisle, Victor and Diane Mercer were whispering and laughing with their attorney, already mentally spending the $5.5 million they were attempting to steal. They didn't even recognize me. Then, the bailiff's voice sliced through the room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Sterling. My biological parents stood, expecting a stranger to emerge from the chambers. Instead, I stood with them. I walked past the wooden bar, up the steps, and took my seat behind the high bench. Their lawyer's confident smirk vanished instantly. Now, I want you to imagine you are the jury. If your parents discarded you like a piece of unwanted luggage just to turn a profit, would you ever grant them a second chance? Or would you seek to destroy them? It was 1994, and Dallas Air-Fort Worth International was the loudest place on Earth. Terminal D hummed with a frequency that vibrated through the soles of my sneakers. People were a blur of motion, announcements chimed incessantly, and the conveyor belts buzzed with a relentless, mechanical drone. But I didn't feel part of the motion. I felt like a stone in a rushing river, heavy and static while the world flowed around me. I was 5 years old, wrapped in an emerald wool scarf that scratched my neck. It was itchy and far too long, dragging against the dirty linoleum, but I refused to take it off. It was the only thing shielding me from the biting draft of the automatic doors. Victor and Diane walked ahead of me. They weren't holding my hand. They were checking their watches, their movements sharp and synchronized. They didn't look like parents who were about to lose their child. They looked like executives running late for a merger. They looked annoyed. Diane glanced back, her eyes narrowing. Keep up, Eleanor. You're slowing us down. They led me past the ticket counters, past the joyful reunions at the gates, all the way down to the oversized baggage claim. It was a cavernous, industrial hollow where golf clubs and car seats were spat out onto a metal carousel. The air smelled of jet fuel and scorched coffee. Wait here, Victor said, pointing to a metal bench bolted to the floor. Watch the bags. We have to go get the tickets. Don't move until we come back. How long? I asked, my voice sounding small in the vast space. Just count the bags, Diane said, her eyes already fixed on the exit signs. Count 500 bags. By the time you finish, we'll be here. I sat down. I pulled the green wool up over my nose and began. 2, 3 are a set of skis, a guitar case, a cardboard box reinforced with duct tape. I counted to 50. I counted to 100. The crowd thinned out. The rhythmic thumping of the belt became hypnotic. 200, 300. By the time I reached 500, the carousel had ground to a halt. The other passengers had vanished with their belongings. The lights seemed to dim, humming with that low-voltage drone that only truly lonely places make. I sat there, gripping the wool of my scarf, and I realized something that a 5-year-old shouldn't have the words to understand. They weren't late. They weren't lost. The look on their faces when they walked away hadn't been panic. It had been relief. They had dropped me off at oversized baggage because that is exactly what I was to them. Heavy, burdensome, something to be checked and never reclaimed. That was when the silence hit me. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against my chest until I couldn't draw a breath. That silence broke something inside me. It stole my voice. For years after that night, I barely spoke. I let the world happen to me because I was too afraid to make a sound. It took me 3 decades to learn that silence could be a weapon rather than a wound. Today, when I sit on the bench and the courtroom goes quiet, waiting for my ruling, I am the one who controls the silence. I use it to command respect. But back then, in Terminal D, the silence commanded me. It told me I was nothing. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. Eventually, a security guard on a patrol vehicle rolled past, did a double take, and circled back. But before he could speak, a man in a charcoal suit stepped out from the shadow of a pillar. He had been standing there for a while, I realized later, watching, waiting to see if anyone would return. He was tall, with kind eyes framed by wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like an accountant. "She's with me," the guard said, reaching for his radio. "I'm calling social services." "No," the man said. His voice was soft, but it cut through the air like tempered steel. He walked over and knelt in front of me, ignoring the grime on the floor. He didn't touch me, he just looked me in the eye, acknowledging my existence. "My name is Arthur," he said. "I saw them leave. I'm sorry." He didn't lie. He didn't tell me they were coming back. He gave me the truth, and in that moment, he saved me from the lie I was trying to tell myself. He stayed with me until the police arrived. He stayed through the foster care placements, and eventually, he stayed for good. He was the safety net that caught me when my own blood let me fall. Arthur's voice was soft, but it held the weight of iron. He knelt there on the terminal floor, oblivious to the grime, and looked me directly in the eye. He didn't offer a hollow touch or a false promise. He simply acknowledged my existence. "My name is Arthur," he said. "I saw them leave. I'm sorry." He didn't lie. He didn't tell me they were coming back. He gave me the truth, and in doing so, he saved me from the desperate fiction I was trying to weave for myself. He stayed with me through the arrival of the police, through the cold uncertainty of the foster system, and eventually, he stayed for good. He was the safety net that caught me when my own blood had let me fall. Arthur passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning, living as modestly as he had always been. There was no fanfare, no headlines, just a small service attended by the staff of the shelters he had quietly funded for decades. I sat in the front row, the emerald scarf draped around me, feeling the familiar weight of the silence return. He had been my anchor, the one person who proved I wasn't just luggage to be discarded. Then came the reading of the will. I had expected perhaps a small house or modest savings account. Instead, the attorney handed me a portfolio thick with history. Arthur hadn't just been a retired accountant. He was a silent titan, an angel investor who had backed 3 of the most successful tech startups of the 90s. He had lived simply so that he could give generously. The final figure was $5.5 million. $100,000 for every year of his 55-year career. He left every cent to me. The news broke 2 days later. Local judge inherits secret fortune. It was the beacon I had dreaded. It took exactly 48 hours for the vultures to circle. It wasn't a phone call or a letter. It was a process server. I was served at my front door with a lawsuit for fraudulent custody and estate theft. The plaintiffs were Victor and Diane Mercer. They didn't call to check on me. They didn't ask for a meeting to explain themselves. They simply sued. Their claim was a masterpiece of fiction. They alleged that Arthur had kidnapped me from the airport 30 years ago, and that they had spent 3 decades as the victims of a sophisticated abduction plot. They demanded the full $5.5 million as restitution for their pain and suffering, along with the deed to Arthur's home. I sat in my living room, reading through the complaint. They described their supposed agony at losing their beloved daughter and the hole in their hearts that never healed. I didn't cry, and I didn't panic. I went into Chambers mode. I looked at the lawsuit not as a daughter, but as a judge reviewing a hostile filing. That was when I saw it, the narcissistic ledger. To a normal parent, a child is a person. To Victor and Diane, I was an asset. In 1994, I had been a liability, a mouth to feed, a burden to be carried through a crowded airport. So, they liquidated me. They left me a baggage claim to cut their losses. But now, 30 years later, my market value had changed. I was no longer a liability. I was a receivable. I came with a $5.5 million price tag. They weren't back because they missed me. They were back because their investment had finally matured, and they wanted to cash out. It wasn't love. It was accounting. They were trying to balance their books with my life. The sheer, unmitigated greed of it burned away the last traces of the frightened little girl inside me. They thought they were suing a victim. They didn't realize they were suing the law itself. I put the papers down. I didn't call a defense attorney immediately. Instead, I walked to the mirror and looked at the woman staring back. I saw the eyes of the child who had counted to 500, and I saw the woman who had put criminals behind bars for far less than this. Motion denied, I whispered to the empty room. I picked up my phone and dialed the most relentless forensic accountant in the state, Margaret Thorne. I need you to dig, I told her. Go back to 1994. Find everything. They want a fight. I'm going to give them a war. And I'm going to make sure the cost of this lawsuit is everything they have left. I didn't answer the suit with a plea. I didn't call Victor or Diane to scream or beg for an explanation. That is what a daughter would do. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a plaintiff building a case against 2 defendants who had made a fatal calculation error. In my line of work, we don't operate on feelings. We operate on evidence. I gave Margaret one instruction. Find out where they got their money 30 years ago. Grifters don't change. If they are greedy enough to sue me now, they were greedy enough to profit off me then. You don't just walk away from a child without trying to capitalize on the loss. For 3 days, my dining room was a war room. We waded through tax returns, property deeds, and court archives that smelled of dust and rot. People assume the past stays buried, but it simply waits in the digital vaults of the county. Margaret found the anomaly on a Tuesday night. Eleanor, she said, her voice flat. Look at 1995. I leaned over her shoulder. There, buried in a stack of digitized filings from the Tarrant County Archives, was a civil docket number, Victor and Diane Mercer versus Atlantic Southern Airlines. They hadn't just walked away from me, they had capitalized on the disappearance. I pulled the full case file. My hands remained steady, cold, as I turned the pages of my own erasure. The complaint was a work of fiction. They claimed that on a November afternoon in 1994, they had entrusted their beloved daughter to an airline agent for an unaccompanied minor flight to visit a sick relative. They alleged gross negligence, claiming I had wandered off and vanished because the staff had failed to watch me. It was a lie. There had been no ticket, no flight, and no sick relative. They had walked me to baggage claim and left me on a bench. But in 1995, in an era before ubiquitous cameras and digital tracking, they could spin a story. They claimed emotional distress and loss of consortium. They painted themselves as broken parents whose child had been swallowed by a corporate machine. Then I saw their settlement agreement. The airline, desperate to avoid a PR nightmare involving a missing child, had settled out of court. The check was for $450,000. In 1995, that was a fortune, enough to buy a house, 2 cars, and a lifetime of silence. But the check wasn't the smoking gun. The real weapon was the affidavit attached to the settlement. To receive the funds, Victor and Diane had been required to sign a sworn statement. I read the words, and for the first time in 30 years, the air felt thin in the room. We, the parents, acknowledge that the minor, Eleanor Sterling, is presumed deceased. We accept this settlement as full and final compensation for the wrongful death and loss of our child, and we absolve the airline of all future liability. They had signed it. Victor's signature was jagged and hurried. Diane's was loopy and neat. They had legally declared me dead. They had looked at a piece of paper that said I no longer existed and signed it in exchange for payout. They hadn't lost me. They had liquidated me. I sat back in my chair. The anger simmering in my gut didn't boil over. It crystallized. It turned into something hard and sharp, like a diamond. They had sold my life for $500,000, spent it, and now they were back to sell me again. They thought I was a ghost. They didn't realize that ghosts can fight back. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. I have it, I said. Don't settle. We're going to trial. I looked at those signatures one last time. They had signed my death warrant 30 years ago. Now, I was going to sign theirs. The trial was pure theater, and Victor and Diane were the headliners. They took the stand wearing muted, respectful colors, their expressions practiced masks of grief. Diane wept on cue, speaking of the hole in her heart and the agony of the unknown. She painted a picture of 2 devoted parents victimized by a wealthy predator who had stolen their baby from a busy terminal. It was a compelling performance. If I hadn't lived the truth, I might have believed them myself. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like victims. They looked like parents who had spent 3 decades setting a place at the table for a ghost. I watched from the defense table, my face impassive. I didn't object. I didn't interrupt. I let them build their monument to grief brick by lying brick, because I knew the higher they built it, the harder it would fall. When the defense's turn finally came, we didn't call character witnesses. We didn't call experts. We called one name. The defense calls Chloe Mercer. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. Victor's head snapped toward the gallery doors. Diane let out a small, strangled gasp. They hadn't seen this coming. They thought Chloe, the daughter they kept, the daughter they raised, was loyal. They thought she was part of the performance. Chloe walked down the aisle. She was 28, a social worker with tired eyes and a posture that seemed to apologize for taking up space. She didn't look at our parents. She looked straight at me. It was like looking into a mirror that had aged in a different light. We had the same nose, the same sharp jawline, but where I had grown hard to survive, she had grown weary from the weight of their lies. She took the stand. She swore the oath. And then, with a quiet, devastating precision, she dismantled their lives. Chloe, my attorney asked, what was it like growing up in the Mercer household? Chloe took a breath that seemed to rattle her entire frame. It was like living in a mausoleum, she said. Her voice was thin but steady. I wasn't just their daughter. I was the replacement. I grew up in the shadow of a tragedy that was carefully curated. But it wasn't about missing Eleanor. It was about using her. This was the ghost sibling paradox. For 30 years, I had assumed Chloe was the lucky one. She was the one who got to go home. She was the one who kept the parents. But as she spoke, I realized I had it wrong. I had escaped. She had been trapped in a 28-year performance. They used the story, Chloe continued. Every time the mortgage was late, every time my father lost money on the horses, they would invoke the tragedy. The church gave them money. The neighbors brought over meals for years. My sister wasn't a person to them, she was currency. Her absence paid our bills. Diane stood up, her face a blotchy, frantic red. Chloe, stop this. Don't you dare. Sit down. The bailiff barked. Chloe didn't even flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a weathered shoe box. It carried the faint, sharp scent of mildew and old attic insulation. They told everyone they spent every cent searching for her, Chloe said. They told me they hired investigators and scoured the country. Last week, while I was clearing out the attic for old photos, I found this. She opened the box. It wasn't filled with missing person posters or correspondence with the police. These are casino receipts, Chloe said, holding up a handful of faded thermal paper. From a riverboat casino in Shreveport. They're dated November 7th, 8th, and 9th, 1994. The very week Eleanor disappeared. While the police were searching the airport, Victor and Diane were at the blackjack tables. They weren't searching for a lost child. They were celebrating a windfall. The silence that followed was absolute. It was that same heavy, suffocating silence I remembered from the baggage claim. But this time, it wasn't crushing me. It was crushing them. Chloe looked at our parents, tears finally breaking through. I used to feel guilty that I was the one who got to stay, she whispered. But now I realize Eleanor was the one who got away. I was the one who was left behind. Victor sank into his chair, a man whose entire existence had just been exposed as a hollow fraud. They hadn't just abandoned one daughter, they had devoured the other. My attorney didn't give the room time to breathe. He walked to the bench and placed a single, yellowed document in front of the presiding judge, a certified copy of the 1995 settlement agreement from the county archives. Your Honor, he said, his voice cutting through the stunned murmurs. The plaintiffs are suing for a share of an estate based on their parental rights. However, according to this sworn affidavit signed in December of 1995, Victor and Diane Mercer legally declared their daughter, Eleanor Sterling, deceased. Victor's face went the color of ash. Diane gripped his arm, her fingernails digging into his cheap suit jacket. They knew exactly what that paper was. It was the receipt for my life. The judge read the document, her eyes narrowing. When she looked up at the plaintiffs, her expression was no longer one of judicial neutrality. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, the judge said, her voice dangerously low. You accepted $450,000 from Atlantic Southern Airlines for the wrongful death of your child. You signed a statement claiming she was gone. One of two things is true right now. Either you committed grand larceny and insurance fraud in 1995, or you are committing perjury and fraud upon this court today. Which is it? The trap snapped shut. If they admitted I was alive back then, they were felons who had stolen $500,000. If they stuck to the story that I was dead, they had no standing to sue me now, because ghosts don't have heirs. Their lawyer, realizing he had been led into a minefield, physically stepped away from them and began packing his briefcase. I stood up. I didn't ask for permission. I walked around the defense table and stood in the center of the aisle, facing them. For 30 years, I had been afraid of these people. I had let their memory haunt every quiet room I entered. But looking at them now, shivering, trapped, and small, I realized I wasn't looking at monsters. I was looking at parasites. "You sold me," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I used the same tone I employed when sentencing a violent offender, cold, flat, and final. "You didn't just leave me at the airport. You cashed me in. You put a price tag on your own daughter and you spent it on blackjack and slot machines." Diane tried to speak. She opened her mouth, tears streaming down her face in the same rehearsed performance she had used on the church, the neighbors, and Chloe for 3 decades. "Eleanor, please," she choked out. "We were young. We were scared. We loved you." "You declared me dead," I interrupted. "You signed a document saying I didn't exist anymore so you could buy a house and a fresh start. Well, congratulations. You were right. The daughter you had is dead. She died in Terminal D." I leaned in closer, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. This was the gavel of silence. I wasn't drowning in it anymore. I was wielding it. A ghost cannot inherit, Victor. A ghost can haunt you. And I promise you, I will haunt you with every legal instrument at my disposal until you wish you had never walked back into my life. The presiding judge slammed her gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Case dismissed with prejudice. Bailiff, please escort the plaintiffs into custody. I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for immediate investigation into insurance fraud, grand larceny, and perjury." Victor and Diane began to scream as the officers moved in, their voices thin and desperate, but I didn't watch. I turned my back on them, just as they had turned theirs on me 30 years ago. The fallout was absolute. While the statute of limitations on the 1995 settlement was a complex legal knot, the perjury they had committed in open court was fresh. They were indicted 3 weeks later. The local news, which had initially been captivated by the story of the judge's secret fortune, now ran a very different headline: "The parents who traded their child." Their reputation was incinerated. The church community they had leaned on for years cut them off. The neighbors who had brought over casseroles and sympathy for 3 decades demanded explanations they couldn't give. They lost their home to legal fees and were left with nothing: no money, no status, and no daughters. I didn't keep the $5.5 million. Arthur hadn't given it to me to buy a life of luxury. He had given it to me to build a safety net. I used the funds to launch the Terminal Foundation. We provide top-tier legal defense for foster children aging out of the system, ensuring that when the state stops caring, someone else steps in. We make sure no child ever has to stand alone in a terminal, wondering if they matter. 6 months later, I sat in a quiet coffee shop in downtown Dallas. Across the table, Chloe was laughing at a story I was telling. She looked different now. The heavy weight had finally lifted from her shoulders. She had quit her previous job and come to work for the foundation as our lead social worker. We were building a relationship from scratch, brick by brick, without the rot of our parents' lies standing between us. I reached for my cup, and the sleeve of my coat pulled up, revealing the emerald wool scarf. I wasn't wearing it because I was cold, and I wasn't wearing it as a shield. I wore it because I liked the way it looked. The shop was noisy, filled with the clatter of porcelain and the low hum of conversation. But for a moment, I let myself listen to the silence underneath it all. It wasn't the terrifying, lonely silence of the airport baggage claim. It was the peaceful silence of a closed case. It was the silence of a debt finally paid in full. I looked at Chloe, then at the work spread out before us, and I realized that Arthur was right. I wasn't the girl who was left behind. I was the girl who was caught.